If you want louder tracks, one of the easiest ways to achieve that is to use a limiter. In today's video, I'm going to break down how you can use a limiter to increase the level of your master so that your track can compete with industry records. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece producer and engineer extraordinaire. Thank you for checking out today's video, and if you haven't already, please hit the bell and subscribe button down below so you can stay tuned for more helpful content. I drop something new every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. If those are two things that you want to do, definitely subscribe to the channel so I can help you with that. But in today's video, we're talking all about limiters and how you can use them to increase the level of your mix and make your master sound very loud and full. Without further ado, let's jump onto Pro Tools and I'll show you what's going on. When you open up a limiter, you're going to realize that a lot of the features that are on it are exactly the same as what you would find on a compressor. And that's not a coincidence. That's because a limiter is really an extreme form of compression. They're basically cousins or siblings. In fact, if you take a compressor and set it with a ratio of 10:1 or greater, that compressor is now a limiter or a brick wall limiter. Now what this means is it's basically an extreme form of compression. It's really going to limit dynamic range, and in fact it's going to prevent your signal, your music, your song from clipping, from peaking, from going into the red and becoming problematic. Now that's not really the main way that you should use it. I'm not saying that if you have a track that's clipping, that's in the red, that's distorted, you should just throw a limiter on there and it's going to fix all your problems. It definitely might, but it's probably not the main way to do that or solve that problem. But what we're going to talk about today is how you can use a limiter to increase the level of your master at the very end of your mixing and mastering process. Now, as I mentioned, you're going to see some things in here that are exactly the same as what you would find on a compressor, such as the gain, the attack, the release, and some other features as well. There's going to be some stuff that's different, but let me just break this down for you. Now I'm using the FabFilter Pro L2 as you can see, and I'm going to focus specifically on features that are common amongst all limiters. So there's going to be some stuff that this thing can do that other limiters can't, and I'm going to probably touch upon them, but more or less I'm going to just focus on the main settings that you need to worry about and how you can apply this, whether you're using a Waves L2 or an L3 or an invisible limiter or something from Isotope or somebody else. It doesn't matter what you're using. I just want you to understand how to use a limiter in your mastering process. Now, the first thing I want to mention is your limiter should basically be the last thing in your chain. Now, I do have a metering plug in here. We're going to use that potentially at some point, but the limiter should always be very, very last. You don't want to put it first and then do some EQ and do some compression and do some other stuff. You want to do this at the very end of your chain, and you really want to use this, in my opinion, to just drive the level of your track and increase the level of your track. Now, speaking of tracks, let's look at this song that I have here. This is something you may recognize. It's my own song. It's coming out soon, and when it does, I'm going to leave a link in the description below, but it's called Can't Hang With Us, Me and My Bro, Everything Ocean. Now, I'm going to play the hook, and I'm going to switch over to this view. We're just going to look at the level here and see how much headroom I've left on my final mix. This is my final mix. There's no mastering on it, no EQ, no compression, none of that on the master bus, just literally how I mixed it with everything off of my final master. So let's take a listen to this real quick and check it out.
I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us. I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us.
All right, so you can see I got at least 3 dB of headroom, but to be honest, it's more than that. 3 dB is pretty much when the drums are hitting, when the claps and the kick drums and stuff like that are happening. That's when it's really hitting that max. But for the most part, I got between -3 and -8 dB of headroom, I would say. So that's sort of the first step of this whole limiting process when you're mastering. It's making sure that you have the headroom available to turn your track up through limiting. And of course, I have that in play. So assuming you have that, let's start to talk about this limiter and what we can do to increase the level of my track and get it to compete with industry records like stuff you would hear on radio or from big artists. Now, if I was to just come into this and set up a limiter, it might look a little bit different depending on how you have it set up. I got my advanced features available here, but the real main parameters you got to focus on is the gain, the attack, the release, and the outsealing. And I am going to talk about oversampling, dither, and lookahead as well, but these are more obscure features in a way. They're not going to be available on every single limiter, whereas the gain, attack, release, and the outsealing will be. Now, the first thing you want to look at when you're setting up a limiter is the outsealing, or the output level, depending on how your limiter labels it. And you can see here that I have mine set to -0.5 dB. And the reason for that is I want to leave a little bit of room for the post-conversion processes that are going to take place. So for example, I'm going to bounce this out as a lossless file, maybe a WAV, maybe an AIFF, maybe a FLAC file, whatever. And it's eventually going to get converted into an MP3. But when that happens, if there isn't a little bit of headroom, in this case at least 0.3 to 0.5 dB, sometimes as much as -1 dB, then what's going to happen is you might have some artifacts or distortion happening. And what this output level ultimately is doing is it's saying this is the loudest level that the track can output at. So it's not going to be any higher than -0.5. It's always going to basically have that 0.5 dB of headroom, and it's very helpful in this case. And it's not really going to be that noticeable either. I know some people might be worried about it, but if you set it to -0.5, nobody is going to know the wiser, and especially when we're driving up the gain and increasing the overall level of the track. After the outsealing is set, we're going to go and approach the attack and the release. The attack and release are very similar to what you would find in a compressor. The attack is how fast the limiter is going to react to the material that you're giving it, and ultimately how fast is it going to turn it down. Whereas the release is the opposite. It's how fast is the limiter going to let go of the material and let it go back to its regular state before the limiter was actually working. And this is really only applicable to stuff that passes a preset threshold, which we're about to talk about in a second, because as you can see, there is no threshold on this limiter, and many other limiters also don't have a threshold functionality. But the key actually for that is the threshold and the gain are 1 on a lot of limiters. So what do I mean by that? You see here there's this gain button. Now gain, once again, is going to be adding volume to a signal. It's going to be adding volume to the track. So here it's +3 dB. That means I'm making my track 3 dB louder than it originally was, right? It's turning it up by 3 decibels, just like if I turned a fader up 3 decibels, exactly the same. But at the same time as that's happening, this is basically tied to the threshold. And what that means is as this is turning up by 3, there's a threshold basically being turned down by 3. And what that means is every time the signal, in this case the mix, passes that -3 dB threshold, it's going to get reduced based on how I've set my attack and release. But at the same time as it's getting reduced, there's going to be some volume being added by this gain here. So the truth is, not everything is going to be turned down. Some stuff is actually going to just get turned up by 3 dB, but then the really excessive loud parts that happen that do pass the threshold of -3, they're also going to be turned up, but they're also going to get reduced in the process. And that gain just sort of makes up the difference. It makes it seem a lot less noticeable, right? But at the same time, it's also keeping the signal, the mix, in check. Now, I think it might be easier if I just show you what this looks like. So let's just play this, and I'm going to set this up. We'll talk a little bit more about it. I'm going to start at 0 and bring it in.
I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us. I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us.
So let's break down a couple of things. First of all, on the right here, this is my gain reduction meter. It's showing me basically what I'm losing, volume-wise. And if you paid attention, you'll notice during certain moments it actually displayed a number saying -2.1, -2.2, etc., as that moment happened and passed by. That was ultimately doing the same thing. It was showing us what we were losing as it was happening. So a lot of times you were noticing that the kicks and the claps combined with the vocal was causing maybe about a minus 2 dB kind of reduction. So it was turning it down by 2 dB. But remember, the gain here is also increasing the overall volume by 6. So in a way, those loud parts were ultimately just being turned up still by maybe 4 dB or so, but it didn't really sound like it. Everything just sounded very cohesive and, of course, a lot louder. And in fact, let me play this right now with it bypassed and put it back in, and you can see how much different the two of them are in terms of volume and level.
I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us. I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us.
You get the idea. You should have really heard that difference. It's a pretty significant volume difference. And volume alone is not the only thing. You don't want to just set this up focused on volume because it's very easy to overdo it, to turn up a limiter way too much and create a lot of problems. You know, when you overdo the limiting, you're going to hear all kinds of stuff getting wonky. You're going to hear the vocal maybe becoming way too forward, but then brittle and harsh at the same time. You might hear your drums getting squashed and stuff like that. In fact, I'm going to play this one more time and I'm going to push it and show you what you don't want. Okay? So check this out. I'm going to just drive this a lot. And again, this is not something I recommend doing. I'm just doing it to prove a point. So check this out.
I know what's involved. They ain't got no girls. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up.
You get the idea. I think you could probably tell what was going on there. You could hear that the bass was just way too much. It was just overpowering, but then it was kind of squashed and weird, flat sounding. That's really the thing. If you overdo the limiting, it can make what you're working on sound very flat. And we don't want to do that because we still want our music to be dynamic and have feel. And dynamics is the important part of that. Without dynamics, you aren't going to have any of that feeling and movement in your track anymore. At least not usually. So pretty simple, as you can tell here. We just have these 4 parameters that we're playing with. But now let's talk about the few things that I didn't. Okay, we can ignore some of these other features like the style and stuff. That's particular to the Pro L2. But one thing I want to look at here is the look ahead. The look ahead is literally what it sounds like. It looks ahead and predicts what's going to happen next. It sees what's coming down the line on your audio track. For example, so you might have some kicks and some snares and stuff approaching. The look ahead is ultimately going to predict that, see that it's happening, and then ultimately handle it better, limit it better, and more transparently as opposed to if I didn't have it engaged. The only catch with that is sometimes look ahead creates latency and other problems related to that. It's fine in a mastering situation, but if you're putting this on a bus and then you have multiple buses, so like in a mix situation, it might cause latency between channels. So if you put it on your drum bus but not your bass bus, those things may now be out of time with each other due to the look ahead. In terms of how I set the look ahead, I typically have it set to 1 millisecond, but you could have more. The next thing I want to focus on here is oversampling. Oversampling is a great little feature. I typically have mine set to at least 4 or 8 times. This could be a very CPU intensive activity. As you can tell, it even warns you here. But if you have the option to oversample, take it, especially when it comes to mastering. It's just going to lead to a more true and accurate product. And finally, we have Dither. The dither is essentially going to add a certain amount of noise, some very not noticeable white noise to your record, and that's going to help get rid of artifacts and distortion that might happen as a result of using the limiter in the first place. Using a limiter is not the best way to do things all the time, but it is sort of a necessary evil when it comes to increasing the overall level of your track. However, in the process, you might deal with certain artifacts. You might notice certain things that appear on the record after limiting. It might change relationships, like I was saying, and dither is a good way to hide that. So whenever you have the option, you do want to turn the dither on. I like to usually have mine at 24 bits, and I usually have an optimized type of weighting or noise shaping. However, play with it as you must. It's not really going to make the biggest difference, but it does help hide some of the imperfections that might happen as a result of using the limiter. So let's break this down one more time just so you understand what we're doing step by step. First, you want to make sure that your song has enough headroom to be turned up with the limiter. If your song is too loud, if it's already peaking and clipping, there's not really going to be much room to turn it up. However, you can still use the limiter to keep it in check and prevent it from clipping. You just won't want to add any gain. Assuming that you do have headroom on your track, the first thing you want to do is set your out ceiling. I typically have mine set to -0.5. However, you could go as much as -1, even beyond that really, but -1 is typically the most I'll go. And that again just preserves enough headroom when you're doing your final bounce to help prevent any issues during the conversion to MP3 process. From there, I'll set my attack and release. I like to set mine very transparently so that way the transients and the song itself doesn't get affected too negatively. And I do that by setting a slower attack, typically between 5,000 and 10,000, and then a quicker release, usually about 50 milliseconds. And the reason why I have the release set to 50 milliseconds, which is fast but not the fastest it could possibly be, is because if you have it set too fast, it might not react appropriately, and that might also create some distortion and issues with your drums and transients in your mix. So I typically have it a little bit slower than the fastest setting. And once you have your attack, release, and out ceiling set up, I will drive my gain until I see a little bit of a reduction. And I'm typically looking for between 0 and 3 dB. I find that is the most transparent. But I also could drive it a little bit further if I feel like it needs to. Certain records do. Certain trap records, for example, can be pushed a little bit further. Whatever really feels appropriate. At the end of the day, I'm using my ears when I'm doing this to make sure that it sounds good. It sounds musical. It's not squashing everything and making it sound problematic. And just making sure it sounds clean and good to go. I don't want this to be a super noticeable thing. I want it to be transparent, as I've been saying. And of course, with those features in mind, I'll definitely use my Lookahead as best as I can. I'll use the oversampling, and I'll use the Dither if it's the last plugin in the chain. I wouldn't want to stack a few with Dither, but if I have just one plugin with Dither at the end, that's totally acceptable. So let's just do an A-B comparison, and let's actually look at the meters as well and see how much volume we're getting before we wrap this up. So check this out. I'll pull open my L2, and let's look at this loudness meter as well at the same time. Here we go.
I know what's involved. They ain't got no goals. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us. I know what's involved. They ain't got no goals. When they on they lonesome, they just hate on us. While I'm stacking up, get my paper up. I don't need them, no sir. They can't hang with us.
So we're getting quite a bit of a difference, right? You're seeing that on the LUFS side, you know, it was at least above 10 for the most part. Now we're below 10, somewhere around even -15 on the short term. On the true peak max, we're closer to that -3 for the peaks. When I didn't have that, we're actually slightly above the peak max. So overall, you can see that it's making a pretty big difference. It's significantly louder, sounds pretty good, sounds transparent, doesn't sound super noticeable. And of course, while I'm doing this like this, I wouldn't just put the limiter on the master. I would probably do some other stuff, some EQ, some compression and stuff beforehand. But you can see how the limiter alone can really do a lot of stuff to make your track pop and compete with other industry records. If you got value out of this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Share it with someone you know it's going to help. And if you want to see something specific from me in a future video, definitely leave it in the comments below so I can shoot something specifically for you. Hope this helped once again, and I'll see y'all later. Peace.
5.